Good morning. Today we're going to be reading chapters 38 through 43 of Serafina and the Splintered Heart. So let's get started with chapter 38. Chapter 38. Serafina, Braden, and Wesa watched Rowena work. The sorceress sat down in her lair and took the black cloak into her lap. The cloak's dark folds roiled and seethed of their own accord when she moved the fabric with her hands, as if she were holding not a garment but a massive, living snake. She drew out a long, thin needle of bone and began to sew, slowly stitching the tears of the black cloak's torn fabric. The outside of the cloak is goat's wool woven with the skin of timber rattlesnakes, Rowena said, so I've used a fine goat's wool thread for the stitching. But the lining of the cloak, where its most important power lies, is black satin made from the silk of black widow spiders. Braden's face wrinkled in revulsion. Spiders? The black cloak is made from spider silk? How do you get usable silk from a spider? It's very difficult, Rowena admitted as she worked, but it is possible if you know the spell. A coercion spell, Braden grumbled. Yes, obviously coercion is required, Rowena said, annoyed at the accusation. Black widow spiders aren't the most willing allies. Believe me, and their venom is exceedingly unpleasant. But their silk is much stronger than the silk of many other spiders. Spiders can make 6 different types of silk. Strong silk for dangling, sticky silk for catching prey, flat silk for flying in the wind, and the others, each for their purpose. It takes all of the black widow's silk twined together to create the thread we need. I use a coercion spell to make the spiders do what I need them to do, and a twining spell to spin the thread. But isn't a spider's silk white or clear? Braden asked, appalled by it all, but beguiled by the gruesome details of the process. It seemed to fascinate him that spiders and other animals were part of the cloak's construction. It was the twining process that turns the thread black, Rowena said. As hour after hour went by, Rowena clutching the twisting cloak, Braden grew restless. Sometimes he paced back and forth through the muck outside the lair, dragging his braced leg behind him. Wesa just watched and waited, his claws out, his tail flicking impatiently, as if he were more than ready should battle come. Serafina watched Rowena carefully, determined to not let the sorceress trick her. She had to stay vigilant. But the truth was, she didn't know how or at what moment Rowena might betray her. Rowena had gone quiet in her work. Her body began to rock back and forth like she was in some sort of trance. The cloak turning and coiling in her hands, but even as she rocked, she kept mumbling and hissing, casting spell after spell as she stitched the torn fabric, rocking and stitching, a witch knitting a dark and wicked curse. The black cloak slithering with power beneath her. Serafina felt her lungs getting tighter, her breaths getting more difficult. As she watched the sorceress, a dark fear grew within her. She pulled her mesmerized eyes away from Rowena and looked out of the lair's damaged door to Braden and Wesa, but suddenly they were gone. They had disappeared. Serafina blinked and rubbed her eyes in confusion, then looked again. Braden and Wesa were still gone. As she gazed out at the forest, she realized that the trees seemed to be fading before her eyes, as if darkness darker than the darkest night were blotting them out in a terrible black fog. It wasn't just her friends who were missing now, but the entire forest. Serafina looked down at the ground she was standing on. It was gone, nothing but darkness. She could not feel it. She could not see it. Everything was going. She pulled in a breath. She could no longer smell the plants of the bog. She could no longer hear the insects. She turned to Rowena in hot panic. All she could see now was the sorceress, her hooded head down, her face shrouded, the black cloak glowing and writhing in her lap as she stitched her last tear closed. The last tear closed. Serafina's world went black. Chapter 39. Serafina could not move. She could not touch or feel. All she could see around her was a black, swirling darkness, like she was inside a storm of soot. All she could hear were the winds of moving fabric. All she could smell was ash. It felt as if the whole world had disappeared, and she was all that was left, utterly alone now and forever. Everything she had known, everything she had loved, was gone, incinerated by a prison of insatiate darkness. She tried to be brave, she tried to be bold, but she couldn't do it. She screamed in terror, "Rowena!" "Do not fight it," came a raspy voice. Confusion flooded into Serafina's mind. Was it the cloak speaking to her? Serafina screamed and she fought. She would not give up. She would not stop fighting. She would tear and tear and tear. She wanted her mother and Braden and her pa and everyone she loved. She wanted to see moonlight and sunlight and starlight and every kind of light there was. The light from inside a friend's soul when they smiled, and the light from the dawn of a new idea. She wanted it all. "You have to let everything go," the voice came. She wanted to hear the rustle of the wind in the trees and the sound of music and the murmur of soft voices. Just let everything go. But she wasn't going to give up. She wanted to feel the coolness of the misty night on her skin and the warmth of the morning sun. "Trust me, Cat. Let everything go." Cat, Serafina thought suddenly. The voice had said Cat. It wasn't the black cloak speaking to her, but Rowena. She was trying to guide her, to show her the way. The sorceress had been her enemy. They had attacked each other, tricked each other, and slashed each other with wounds. But was she still her enemy? Or had Rowena truly switched sides? And then a different kind of thought came into Serafina's mind. She knew that despite many vicious and deceitful deeds Uriah had forced his daughter to do, Rowena had always wanted Braden as her friend. "You don't even know what friendship is," Rowena had screamed at her in frustration. "I've seen it." She'd seen it and she wants it, Serafina thought, and now I've forced Rowena to promise that if I don't make it, then she'd join with Braden at Biltmore. Serafina had thought she had exacted a difficult promise from Rowena, but now she realized that it might have suited Rowena just fine. All that time playing the role of Lady Rowena, the sorceress had been pretending to like Braden. Maybe the trick was that she wasn't pretending. Was that Rowena's plan now, to get rid of her and have Braden's friendship to herself? By persuading Serafina to go into the cloak, had Rowena finally managed to trick her rival out of existence? Serafina didn't know what was in Rowena's heart, but she saw two paths before her. She could trust Rowena, stop fighting, and let her soul be pulled entirely into the black cloak, or she could try to keep fighting in this storm of oblivion. She thought about how important it was that Braden had learned from Rowena's deceit months before, that sometimes he shouldn't trust people. She thought how she herself had learned that sometimes she should trust people. Despite all of Rowena's duplicitous shifts and caustic moods, she had helped her talk to Braden. She had helped her spell the letters in the ash in front of the fireplace, and she had revealed the secrets of the black cloak. Was it possible that Rowena might have feelings for Braden? But convincing Serafina to get pulled back into the black cloak wasn't necessarily a malicious trick designed to eliminate her. Was it possible that both of those things could be true at the same time? Serafina realized that she didn't know the answer to the questions. It was a terrifying feeling, but there was no way to know. But she did know that here in this dark, swirling place, and in the spirit world where she'd been wandering, there was no good path. There was nothing there. Even if she fought back to the place she'd been, there was nothing there. No voice, no touch, no love. Her only hope was forward. Her only hope was the unknown. "Trust me," Rowena had said. "Trust me." Serafina knew that she might not return to the land of the living. She might not ever see the world again. In her mind, she began to say goodbye to Braden and to Wasa. She said goodbye to her pa and to her mother and to the cubs, and Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt, and everyone else she knew. One by one, she said goodbye to all of them. Her only hope was that she had somehow helped them. Finally, she shut her eyes and pulled in a long, deep breath, her chest rising, filling her lungs with the sooty black void. She held her breath for as long as she could, knowing that it would be her last. Like a person trapped underwater, knows the inhalation will finally drown her lungs in a watery death. Then she exhaled, and her mind unfurled as the cloak sucked her soul deep into its void. as she disappeared into the black folds that she had seen take so many souls before her. She had no body, she had no wandering spirit. All she had was consciousness, churning through the black prison. She finally knew what Clara Brams, Anastasia Romanoff, and her mother and all the other victims of the Black Cloak had experienced. She had no perception of time or change. Each moment might be a fleeting second, a drop of water as it falls to the floor and splashes into nothingness. Or it might be a whole year of bountiful experience lost. Every moment she'd ever spent with the people she loved. She did not know. There was no up or down, no action or effect, no hard or soft, no brightness or color, no movement or sensation, no voice or touch, no shape or beauty, or love or compassion. Rowena had trapped her in a black, empty world. Chapter 40. Okay, Serafina opened her eyes and saw nothing but black. It was as if she hadn't opened her eyes at all. She had been deep in the darkened void of a swirling, half-dreaming world when she was awoken to the sound of a muffled voice. But now there was no voice, no sound, no movement of any kind, just black. She closed her eyes and reopened them, but it made no difference. It was still pitch dark, but she wasn't floating in the black void of the cloak anymore. She was lying on her back on a long, flat, cold surface. Where am I, she thought. How did I get here? Then a sound finally came, a thudding in her ears that was more real, more pressing than anything she had ever heard. Thump, thump. For a moment, that was all there was. Thump, 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 thump. The beat of her heart and the pulse of her blood. Thump, 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 thump. As she slowly moved her tongue to moisten her cracked, dry lips, she detected the faint taste of metal in her mouth. But it wasn't metal, it was blood. Her own blood flowing through her veins, into her tongue and her lips. She tried to clear her throat, but then, all at once, she took in a sudden, violent, jerking breath and sucked in a great gasp of air, as if it was the very first breath she had ever taken. As her blood flowed, a tingling feeling flooded into her arms and legs, and all through her body. My body, she thought, trying to comprehend it. I'm in my body. I'm alive. I'm truly alive. She frantically tried to think back and remember what had happened to her, but it was like trying to grasp the fleeting details of a powerful dream that drifts away the moment you awake. She pulled in air into her nostrils, hoping to draw a clue from what she could smell around her. Dirt, she thought. I'm surrounded by damp, rotting dirt. Chapter 41. Serafina quickly twisted around inside the coffin that surrounded her, pressing her hands against the cold, hard wood, her palms sweating. Her breaths were getting shorter. Her lungs tightened, making it more and more difficult to breathe. A surge of panic poured through her. Her soul had reunited with her body. She was alive. But now she was going to run out of air and die. She kicked her feet against the end of the coffin. She pounded her fists. She scratched and she scurried. She twisted and she pried, but she could not escape. Just as before, the boards surrounding her on all sides, close and narrow and low. She hissed with frustration. After all she'd been through, she was going to suffocate in a black coffin buried 6 feet under the ground. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. She wanted to scream and cry. Quit your mewling, girl, and get on with making yourself useful, she imagined her pa telling her. Figure out what needs to be done and do it. Gritting her teeth, she tore off her dress and wrapped it around her head to protect her nose and mouth. Then she spun around onto her stomach, put her shoulders in the center of the coffin's lid, and pushed. She pushed, and she kept pushing over and over again, hammering her shoulder against the center board. Bang, bang, bang. When she finally felt the board cracking, she spun around and pulled at the edge of it with her fingers. A massive heap of dirt poured on top of her, crushing her down. She shoved the dirt into the corners of the coffin until she had packed away as much of it as she could. Then she pushed her head up into the hole and started digging, scraping frantically with her bare hands. The loose earth poured down around her head and shoulders, collapsing onto her faster than she could dig it away. She felt the pressing, suffocating weight of it all around her, closing in on her, crushing her chest, trapping her legs, but she kept clawing, kicking, squirming her way blindly through the darkness, desperately trying to breathe. She dug frantically toward the surface, but she knew she wasn't going to make it. She was too small, too weak, too frail, too dull. Her puny, soft skin-covered fingers were nothing against the dirt. She was going to die. No, 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 she growled deep in her throat until she was making one continuous growl. She had one moment, and the moment was now. She could stop moving, stop breathing, let the earth win, or she could envision what she wanted to be and become it. She growled and she kept growling, the anger building inside her. She felt it coming now. She felt her whole body beginning to change. It was unstoppable now. She envisioned her mountain lion mother and her black panther father. She was a catamount through and through. She was the black one, the warrior leader of the forest. It came like a great volcano, exploding from deep within her. Suddenly the earth around her expanded with a great heave, giving way to her newly muscled girth. She felt her tail twisting, her 4 feet clenching and clawing against the dirt. She began digging anew, filled with panther strength and power. Her claws tore into the earth, ripping it away with lion ferocity. Her powerful legs pushed her upward towards the surface, toward air, toward life. Her face and whiskers pushed against the dirt. Her panther ears pressed back against her head as she shoved herself upward. Her powerful chest filled with a deep, dark, throbbing growl, like the roll of thunder through the ancient mountains where she'd been born into the darkened world. As she dug, she heard a frenzy of scratching noise digging down toward her. Her upstretched claws clacked with the claws of another catamount. It was Wesa, digging frantically, and Gideon digging at his side. "You're almost there," Braden shouted as he dug toward her. "Come on, Cat, dig," Rowena urged as she pulled handfuls of dirt away. Finally, Serafina thrust her panther head up into the air and took in a long, deep, desperately needed breath. She felt the warm night pouring into her mouth and down her throat and into her lungs. She felt her lungs filled with the blessed air, expanding like a great bellows, her chest heaving, pushing easily against the loose dirt still around her. She felt her heart pumping, her bones pushing, and every muscle in her body at her beck and call. "You made it," Braden shouted as she clambered the rest of the way out. "You made it." Standing on 4 feet now, she threw the dirt from her black cloak with a mighty shake. The entire world loomed large. She saw the angel's glade in the forest and the stars above the trees. Her lungs could finally breathe. She was alive in the world, whole and complete. She was alive. She lifted her yellow panther eyes and gazed at the smiling faces of her friends all around her. Chapter 42. Serafina shifted into human form and looked around her at the angel's glade, trying to understand what had happened. "We destroyed it," Braden told her excitedly. Serafina looked over at the statue of the angel and saw the molten remnants of the black cloak lying in a pile on the ground below the angel's sword. The tight spider weave and binding spells of the cloak's fabric had disintegrated into a hot, smoldering heap as it released the energy within it. The smoky effluent drifted across the angel's glade and the graveyard beyond. They had pierced the cloak on the angel's sword just as she had done months before when she freed Clara Brams and the other victims trapped inside the cloak. Even though she knew she should have been expecting it, it took Serafina several seconds to comprehend that destroying the cloak had broken its spell, reunited her 3 splintered parts, and freed her from its dark imprisonment. "When we destroyed the cloak, we thought we would find you lying on the ground, like when you freed Clara and the other children," Braden said, "but we didn't." "The damaged cloak had torn you apart," Rowena said. "When the spell broke, your freed spirit fled to your human body in the grave. And the essence of your panther body was pulled in as well," Wesa said. "It wasn't until I heard you digging that I realized what had happened and told the others. We all started digging as fast as we could," Braden said. Serafina was amazed. Their plan hadn't worked exactly the way they had expected, but it did work. "We all started digging as fast as we could," Braden said. Serafina was amazed. Serafina was amazed. Their plan hadn't worked exactly the way they had expected it, but it did work. She looked at Braden when she could see the exhilaration and relief sparking in his eyes, a large smile on his face. "I can't believe it," he said. "You made it. After all this time, you're truly here. You're alive." He moved toward her and embraced her, so pleased that he lifted her off her feet and swung her around. She laughed in joy at his enthusiasm. It felt amazingly good to wrap her arms around him and hug him, to finally embrace him, to truly feel her friend's warm, living body. As she held onto him, she could feel the rapid beat of his heart against her chest, the movement of air through his lungs as he breathed, and the tremble in his hands as he held her. She could feel everything, and she knew he could feel her. This was the world, she thought, the true and living world, and she was in it. In the distance, over Braden's shoulder, a blaze of falling stars streaked across the glistening darkness of the nighttime sky. Down in her soul, she felt as infinite as the heavens upon which she gazed, filled with a deep gratitude just to be back with the people she loved. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Braden," she said as she held him, unable to control the quiver of appreciation in her voice. "You're welcome," he said. "I knew that if we could find a way, you'd come back to us." As she slowly separated from Braden, she looked at Wesa, who had shifted into his human form. Wesa stood before her now, tall and grinning and happy. "Welcome back," he said, and they embraced. She felt the strength of her friend's arms and the pride in his chest. She felt the warrior in him, the satisfaction of finally winning a battle against their enemy. And she felt the serenity in him, the happiness that they were finally back together. She and Wesa had shared so much together. They had run through the forest, slept behind waterfalls, and swam in mountain pools, but nothing compared to the joy of this moment. She gazed at Braden and Wesa, and she smiled. Her two friends had waited for her, fought for her, did everything they could to make this night happen, and they finally succeeded. Finally, Serafina turned and looked at Rowena. The sorceress in her dark robes, with her hood and her long red hair coiled loosely around her shoulders, stood quietly nearby. She was watching them, her green eyes bright and alive, but flickering with an uncertain wariness. "I'm not going to embrace you if that's what you're thinking, Cat," Rowena said. Serafina smiled and nodded. "I know," she said. "But thank you, Rowena. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. You saved me." "I put you there," Rowena said, reminding her. "And now I brought you back." Serafina wasn't sure if she was saying that she had righted the wrong, or that they were even, or maybe something else. But either way, Serafina said, "I thank you for what you did tonight." As Serafina spoke with her friends, she couldn't help but take in the world around her. She felt her 2 feet firmly on the ground, so simple but so profound, to have weight, to have effect, to not be floating in the air or disintegrating into vapor, but to have substance, to have presence, to truly be in a place in command of her body. She smelled the willow trees around the glade and heard the soft orchestra of buzzing insects. Gone was the feeling of being a droplet of water or a mote of dust. Gone was the feeling of being a gust of wind that might drift away at any moment. She was alive, truly alive. She was whole again, solid and firm, body and soul. She had never felt better in her life. And as she stood there looking around her in amazement, she slowly began to realize there was something else, too. Something new. When she turned her ears just right, she could hear the gentle movement of the breeze in the boughs of the trees above her. She could sense the droplets of dew clinging to a leaf, feel it falling through the vibrating air, and hear it hit the ground and soak into the dusty soil. She could see the breath of the trees with her eyes, and the rise of water in the clouds. To the clouds. Everything around her felt closer, finer, more acute. The rising of the moon, the falling of the stars, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. She knew she'd come close to dying. She had walked in between. Her spirit had lingered in the world, but now she sensed that the world lingered in her. She felt the quiet rocks of the earth, the flow of the distant rivers, the drift of the clouds above. She could see and feel the spirit of the world all around her. As she gazed from one point to the next, trying to understand her new senses and powers, she noticed a faint glint of moonlight on the ground over the destroyed remnants of the black cloak. It was but a small reflection of light at first, but she walked toward it. The glint became so bright that it was almost blinding to her. She reached down beside the black pile of the ruined fabric and picked up the cloak's silver clasp. It felt heavy in her hand. In the past, the clasp's design had been a twisted weave of thorny vines. She'd even seen the little faces of children behind the vines. But tonight, the clasp was blank, without any design at all. Serafina turned and walked back toward Braden. He smiled at her, still elated with their success. "You'd better hide this," she said, as she slipped the clasp into his hand. It still amazed her to think that Braden had hid the damaged cloak from their enemies all that time, fearing its black hissing power, but clinging to the hope that one day, somehow, some way, he would be able to bring her back into the world. And tonight was what? That was what? And tonight was that night. He had done it. She moved toward him to embrace him again, but Rowena stepped between them. This is a sweet reunion and all. We'll be sure to all have tea together sometime, Rowena said in a biting tone. But my father is going to sense the destruction of the cloak. He's going to come. And when he does, he'll be bent on black vengeance like nothing you've ever seen. Angry that cat has escaped, but even angrier that I helped her to do it. Serafina knew Rowena was right. She gazed around at her friends. Whatever happens, the four of us are in this together now. Chapter 43. Yeah, okay. As soon as she arrived at Biltmore, Serafina ran down to the workshop. She stopped to catch her breath just outside the door. Then she stepped slowly into the room and gazed upon her pa. He was near his cot behind the supply racks, the cot he'd slept on all the years she could remember. He was performing a simple task, straightening the blanket on his bed, but to her it seemed to be the most profound of actions. There was the man who had raised her, who had fed her and cared for her all her life, who had taught her all that he could teach her, who had guarded and protected her, and held her close every night. She was so quiet, so still, standing there behind him, that for a moment she almost wasn't sure whether she was spirit or whole. But then, with hot tears welling up in her eyes, she finally said, "I came home as soon as I could, Pa." Her pa froze in his movement. He did not turn or say a word. For several seconds, it was as if he had not heard her at all, or perhaps he did not believe what he had heard. But then he slowly turned his head to the side, as if waiting for the sound to come again, and then he turned his body and looked at her. He gazed upon her with awe, like a believing man who was come face to face with a winged angel. At first he was unable to speak, but finally he smiled, and his face wrinkled, and he wiped the tears from his eyes and said, "Now you come on over here and see your pa." She walked forward and collapsed into his arms, not just crying, but bawling. "I'm sorry, Pa. I'm so sorry I couldn't get home. I tried and I tried, but I couldn't get home," she wailed. He pulled her against his barreled chest, wrapped his thick arms around her, and held her tight. She pressed her head against his chest, and she held him in her trembling arms. As she let herself fall into him, he pulled in a long, dreaming breath, her chest heaving with the exhalation of being there with him at this moment. She felt the warmth of his embrace and heard the sigh of his breathing as he held her. It was a miracle. She could feel him. She could truly feel him, and he could feel her. Around her, she smelled the cotton fabric of his shirt and the grease he'd worked with that day, and the familiar musk of his body, all mixed with the smells of the workshop, the solid oak benches and the half-burned coal, and the little stove where they cooked their meals, and the gritty stone of the floor, and the oiled metal of the hammers and wrenches and other tools. She was alive. She was finally back in the workshop, back in her pa's arms. She was finally home. In the time that followed, she took a long, warm bath, washed off the grave dirt and the blood stains, and changed into a simple, clean dress. It felt as if she was living in the lap of luxury. As they settled in for the night, it seemed like neither of them could quite believe that it was truly real. They kept looking at each other, touching each other, as if constantly wanting to make sure. Her pa cooked an elaborate supper of chicken and dumplings with his favorite gravy, fried okra and grits, smothered in warm butter and cheese. She was so famished that she ate it all and wanted more. Whether it was drinking a glassful of cool, clear water or eating a meal with her pa, the simplest routines of her life had become the most glorious pleasures. "You're doing a good fine job on your supper there," her pa said happily as she scraped down to the bottom of the metal plate. "It just tastes so good," she said, meaning it true, and it brought a smile to his face. Over supper, her pa started talking, not with any particular purpose in mind, but just to talk, just to celebrate like everything was all right again. He spun his usual tales of mending machines and solving the challenges of his day-to-day life. She had always loved his stories, in which he was the humble hero fighting against impossible odds with wrench and hammer in hand, and she had never loved the stories more than on this night. She wanted to tell him that she had seen the beautiful fairy lights he had strung in the garden on the night of the evening party, his shining beacon for her to follow home, and she wanted to tell him how proud she was of him the night she had seen him smiling, dressed in his suit, in the glow of the glittering summer ball. Later on, as they washed their dishes, her pa took on a more serious tone. "I know you might not be too keen on talking about it just yet, Sarah," he said, "but what happened to you all this time?" It was difficult to know how to answer his question in a way that he or anyone could understand, but she did the best she could. She was pretty sure that her pa had an inkling that somehow her mother was a mountain lion, but she didn't think he knew that she too walked on 4 feet when she wanted to. If he did suspect it, it was something he didn't like to think about. He didn't like to think about haints and demons and other creatures of the night. To him, she was his daughter, a human being, a 12-year-old little girl that he cherished more than anything in the world, and he didn't like to think of her in any other way. And she was sure that it would come as quite a shock to him if he ever saw her as a crouched, snarling, clawing, leaping Black Panther. But she knew he had some idea of the strange and unusual things that happened in the dark of night, for he had warned her of them many times. "You remember our old enemies," Serafina began, "the ones who captured the animals in the cages up in the pine forest a few months ago?" he said, and she nodded her head. "They came back, Pa. They attacked me, and I was wounded something awful." As her pa listened, she could tell by the expression in his eyes that it was difficult for him to hear. "They caught me in a dark place, and I couldn't escape," she said. As she continued her story, telling him what she could and leaving out what she could not, he listened intently. She had been around him all her life, so she knew it wasn't the kind of story he wanted to hear, but he listened anyways, for he knew he must. He knew that what he was hearing was what had happened to her, and she could see in his eyes and his expression that he wanted to understand. He'd been waiting and imagining and praying for her safe return for so long now that he wanted to know everything he could. He wanted to have that bond between them, the bond of knowing. "So it was the young master who finally helped you to escape?" he said. She nodded. "Yes, it was." "He was a gone miserable lad while you were away," her pa said, recounting a bit of how it was from his side of it all. "The master and I, the two of us as doleful as cold poke, used to talk about it, trying to figure out what we could do for the lad, but I think our talks did more for the pair of us menfolk than they did the poor boy. But in the end, I reckon he figured a way through it all on his own." "I reckon he did," she said in agreement, but refrained from saying any more. Her fondness for Braden had become immeasurable, but it wasn't something she could easily talk about with her pa. "And you thanked him kindly for what he did?" he said, always wanting to make sure she was doing right by other folk. She nodded, assuring him that she had thanked Braden, and that she would again. "And what about your mother?" her pa asked. He didn't know her personally, but he knew that her mother was important to her. "Have you been able to see her since you returned?" Serafina's heart clouded in sadness. "No," she said. "She went away, and I have no way to reach her." "Well, I hope she's all right," her pa said, but it was clear that he didn't know what else to say. Serafina's thoughts lingered. She didn't quite know how to ask the question that had been swirling around in her mind since she'd crawled from the grave, but she thought that if anyone could help her, maybe her pa could. "Pa, does it feel to you like so much has changed since I've been gone? Everything feels so different." But in other ways, her words dwindled off. She could see right away that she wasn't going to be able to express it the way she wanted to. But he looked at her and said, "I think I understand what you're getting at. The way I see it, everything is always changing, and everything is always staying the same." His words shouldn't have made sense to her, but somehow they almost did. "You see, everything around us is always changing," he continued. "The machines and the inventions, the people coming and going through our lives, even our own bodies over time. Yours is growing up, and mine is getting old. The trees in the forest are changing, and the courses of the rivers. Even our own minds are changing, growing and learning, finding new paths to follow, shifting and shaping over time. But if everything is always changing, what can we hold on to? She asked. That's where the rest of it comes in, Sarah, her pa said. Everything's always changing, but everything is always staying the same, too. The trees are growing and dying, but the forest remains. No matter how the river changes course from year to year, it always keeps flowing. Your body and your mind are changing, but deep down, your soul, your inner spirit stays the same. I'm the same deep down inside as that I was when I was 12 years old, and the spirit you feel inside you tonight will be with you 50 years from now. Yes, you'll be different. The whole world will be different, but the spirit inside you, the thing that makes you you, will still be there. But if we're always growing and changing, I don't understand how that can be, she said. Look at Mr. Vanderbilt, her pa said. When he was your age, he was a kind but quiet little boy who loved to read books, study art, and travel to faraway places. Now he's a great man of wealth and power. But he's a kind and quiet man who loves to read books, study art, and travel to faraway places, she said, finishing his thoughts. That's right, her pa said, smiling. The 12-year-old little boy will be the 50-year-old man. It's been him the whole time, all the way through. His body has changed, and everything around him has changed, but his spirit has always been with him. Serafina nodded, feeling like she was beginning to understand. You asked me what we could hold on to, her pa said. I'll tell you this. You hold on to the people around you, Sarah, to your friends and family, to the people you love, and you hold on to that spirit deep down inside that never leaves you, that spirit that's always flowing like a river inside you. Finally, her pa paused. He looked at the floor for a moment, as if thinking about his own words a bit longer, and then looked at her. Does any of my blither blather feel like it makes any kind of sense to you? Serafina smiled and nodded. It did indeed. She was pretty sure that her pa couldn't reckon the soul-splitting, hate-walking horror of what she'd been through, but somehow he seemed to have sensed just the right words to say to her. There's one more thing, Pa, she said, that I need your help with tonight. Another question? He asked gently. No, she said sheepishly. I need you to help me make something. Make something, he said in surprise, for in all her life with him in the workshop, she had never expressed any interest to fix something or make something. She was absolutely the least mechanically inclined person who had ever prowled the night. You've seen how Braden wears a brace on his bad leg, she said. Yes, he said, a twinge of sadness in his voice. One of the metal pieces at the joint broke, she said. I would like to see if we can come up with some way not to just fix it, but to improve it. Maybe something that's less like a bone and more like a tendon? Her pa looked at her and smiled a broad and happy smile. That was definitely something he could do. Over the next few hours, they worked together, shoulder to shoulder in the workshop, long into the night, making little test pieces and discussing and exploring different ideas, until they constructed a design they liked. She had never worked at her pa's side before, not like this. She had never had a need for man-made constructions, so it was an entirely new experience for her. And it brought her great joy, the act of actually creating something with her pa at her side. Later that night, when they finally went to sleep, she curled up between her sheets, her head on the pillow, and it felt just about as fine as anything Ed had ever felt. She knew there were dark and terrible dangers out there in the forest. She knew there was still a fight ahead of her, but tonight she was home with her pa. And for a little while, that's all she wanted. Everything is always changing, and everything is always staying the same.